The golden gates of Valdoria Palace gleamed under the morning sun as King Alexander VII stood at his office window, watching the royal gardens bloom with spring flowers. At 62, he carried himself with the dignity expected of a monarch who had ruled the kingdom of Valdoria for over 2 decades. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and his blue eyes held the weight of countless royal duties and decisions that had shaped his reign. Queen Isabella sat in her private chambers, reviewing the day's schedule with her personal secretary, Lady Margaret. The 48-year-old queen had always been known for her grace and charity work, but lately, something seemed different about her demeanor. Her usual warm smile appeared forced, and she often gazed out the window with a distant look in her eyes. The royal couple had married 15 years ago, after King Alexander's first wife, Queen Catherine, had died tragically in a car accident. The nation had mourned deeply, and when Alexander found love again with Isabella, a successful businesswoman from a noble family, the people welcomed her with open arms. Their wedding had been called the wedding of the century, watched by millions around the world. However, palace life was never as perfect as it appeared to the outside world. Behind the marble walls and golden doors, tensions had been building for months. The king's trusted advisor, Lord Edmund Blackwood, had been noticing subtle changes in the queen's behavior. She had been taking more private trips to the capital city, claiming they were for charity work, but her security detail reported visits to locations that had nothing to do with her public duties. Lord Blackwood was a man who had served the royal family for over 30 years. His loyalty was unquestionable, and his ability to gather information was legendary within the palace walls. He had a network of contacts throughout the kingdom, from high-ranking officials to common citizens who respected the crown. When whispers began reaching his ears about the queen's activities, he initially dismissed them as palace gossip. But, as the reports became more frequent and detailed, he knew he had to investigate further. The first sign of trouble came during a state dinner in March. Queen Isabella had excused herself early, claiming a headache, but palace security cameras showed her leaving through a side entrance where a private car waited. The vehicle was registered to a company owned by Marquis Delacroix, a wealthy businessman who had recently moved to Valdoria from neighboring Bretonnia. Delacroix was known for his charm and success in international trade, but his background remained somewhat mysterious. As spring turned to early summer, the queen's absences became more frequent. She would cancel royal engagements at the last minute, citing various illnesses or family emergencies. The king, busy with his own duties including upcoming trade negotiations with several European nations, initially accepted his wife's explanations without question. He trusted Isabella completely and believed in her commitment to their marriage and the crown. Lord Blackwood, however, continued his quiet investigation. He discovered that Marquis Delacroix had been renting a luxury apartment in the most exclusive district of the capital city. The apartment was registered under a false name, but financial records traced back to his business empire. More concerning were the reports from reliable sources that Queen Isabella had been seen entering and leaving this apartment building on multiple occasions. The palace photographer, James Crawford, who had worked for the royal family for over a decade, accidentally captured something that would change everything. While taking official photos during a charity event in the city, his telephoto lens caught sight of 2 figures on a balcony of a tall building in the distance. Through his professional equipment, he could clearly see Queen Isabella in an intimate embrace with a man who was definitely not her husband. Crawford was torn between his loyalty to the crown and his duty as a palace employee. He knew that such photographs could destroy the monarchy's reputation and cause a constitutional crisis. For days, he kept the images to himself, hoping he had been mistaken. But when he enhanced the photos using professional software, there was no doubt about what he had captured. Meanwhile, King Alexander began noticing changes in his wife's behavior during their private moments. Isabella seemed distant and distracted during royal functions. Their conversations, once filled with shared laughter and planning for the kingdom's future, became polite but superficial. When he tried to discuss their upcoming wedding anniversary celebration, she showed little enthusiasm for the elaborate plans being made by the Royal Event Planning Committee. The breaking point came during a family dinner in late June. The royal couple was dining alone in their private quarters when King Alexander mentioned his plans to surprise Isabella with a romantic getaway to their favorite retreat in the mountains. Instead of the joy he expected to see in her eyes, he saw panic. She quickly made excuses about her charity commitments and suggested postponing the trip indefinitely. That night, King Alexander couldn't sleep. He found himself walking through the palace corridors, something he often did when troubled. The palace at night was peaceful, but somehow seemed to echo with secrets. He made his way to Lord Blackwood's office, knowing his advisor often worked late into the evening. Lord Blackwood was indeed at his desk, surrounded by documents and photographs. When the king entered unexpectedly, his advisor quickly tried to cover the materials on his desk. But Alexander had already seen enough to know that something serious was being investigated. With a heavy heart, Lord Blackwood realized the time had come to reveal what he had discovered. The conversation that followed lasted until dawn. Lord Blackwood presented evidence carefully and respectfully, knowing that what he was sharing would shatter the king's world. The photographs, the security reports, the financial records, and witness statements all painted a clear picture of Queen Isabella's secret relationship with Marquis Delacroix. King Alexander listened in stunned silence as his most trusted advisor laid out the facts. The woman he had loved and trusted, the woman who had helped him heal after his first wife's death, had been deceiving him for months. The betrayal cut deeper than any political crisis he had ever faced because this was not just about his role as a king, but about his heart as a man. As the sun rose over Valdoria Palace, King Alexander sat alone in his office, staring at the evidence before him. The golden light that had seemed so beautiful just hours earlier now felt harsh and unforgiving. He knew that decisions made in the next few days would not only affect his personal life, but could shake the very foundations of the monarchy that his family had built over centuries. The palace staff began their daily routines, unaware that their king had just learned of a betrayal that would soon change everything. Queen Isabella was still sleeping in the royal chambers, not knowing that her secret had been exposed. In a few hours, she would wake up to a world where her carefully constructed double life was about to crumble. Lord Blackwood quietly secured all the evidence and began preparing for what he knew would be the most difficult period in the palace's recent history. The Kingdom of Valdoria was about to face a royal scandal that would test the strength of its institutions and the loyalty of its people. The crown that had weathered wars, economic crises, and political upheavals was now facing its greatest challenge from within. As the morning progressed, and the palace came to life with its usual activities, King Alexander made a decision that would echo through history. He would not act in haste or anger, but he would act with the dignity and strength that his position demanded. The betrayal he had discovered was not just a personal wound, but a threat to the monarchy itself, and he would handle it as both a wounded husband and a responsible king. The next morning brought an unusual tension to Valdoria Palace. King Alexander had barely slept, spending most of the night pacing his private study and reviewing the devastating evidence that Lord Blackwood had presented. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than it did in those dark hours before dawn. Every photograph, every security report, every witness statement confirmed what his heart desperately wanted to deny. Queen Isabella woke in their shared chambers, completely unaware that her world was about to collapse. She went through her morning routine with practiced elegance, preparing for what she believed would be another ordinary day of royal duties. Her lady-in-waiting, Elena, noticed nothing unusual as she helped the queen dress in an elegant blue suit for the morning's charity board meeting. However, the palace staff who worked closely with the king could sense that something was deeply wrong. His usual warm greetings were replaced with formal nods, and his eyes carried a sadness that seemed to penetrate everything around him. The head butler, William, who had served the royal family for over 20 years, mentioned to his wife that he had never seen the king look so troubled, not even during the most difficult political crises. King Alexander's first decision was to seek counsel from his most trusted advisors beyond Lord Blackwood. He privately summoned Archbishop Gregory, who had been the royal family's spiritual advisor for decades, and Prime Minister Sarah Mitchell, who represented the government's interests in royal matters. The meeting was scheduled for late morning in the king's private conference room, a space rarely used except for the most sensitive discussions. Meanwhile, Marquis Delacroix was in his luxury apartment, completely unaware that his secret relationship with Queen Isabella had been discovered. He was preparing for what he believed would be another clandestine meeting with the queen later that afternoon. His phone contained dozens of intimate text messages and photos that would serve as additional evidence of the affair. The businessman had grown confident in his ability to remain hidden from royal security, not knowing that every move had been carefully documented. Lord Blackwood spent the morning gathering additional evidence and preparing detailed reports for the king's upcoming meetings. His network of informants had provided even more disturbing information about the affair's timeline and scope. The relationship appeared to have begun during a charity gala 6 months earlier, where Marcus had been introduced to the Queen as a potential major donor to her children's education foundation. The charity board meeting that Queen Isabella attended that morning proceeded normally, with discussions about funding for new school programs in rural areas of Valdoria. Isabella's assistant, Lady Margaret, later reported that the Queen seemed unusually distracted during the presentations and asked to leave early, claiming she needed to review important documents for an upcoming state visit. What Lady Margaret didn't know was that Queen Isabella was actually planning to meet Marcus at their secret apartment. The Queen had become skilled at using her royal duties as cover for her personal activities, a deception that had worked for months but was now about to be exposed in the most dramatic way possible. At 11 in the morning, King Alexander met with Archbishop Gregory and Prime Minister Mitchell. The conversation was perhaps the most difficult of his reign. As he presented the evidence of his wife's betrayal, both advisors listened in shocked silence. The implications were staggering, not just for the royal family, but for the entire kingdom. Archbishop Gregory, a man known for his wisdom and discretion, spoke first about the moral and spiritual dimensions of the crisis. He reminded the king that while the personal pain was immense, the dignity of the crown must be preserved. The church had always supported the monarchy, but this scandal could create divisions among the faithful who looked to the royal family as moral leaders. Prime Minister Mitchell addressed the political ramifications with characteristic directness. A royal divorce would require parliamentary approval and could trigger constitutional discussions about the role of the monarchy in modern Valdoria. The government needed time to prepare for the public relations crisis that would inevitably follow any announcement of marital problems within the royal family. Both advisors agreed that immediate action was necessary, but it had to be carefully planned and executed. The king's reputation for dignity and strength had to be maintained while ensuring that the truth was revealed in a way that minimized damage to the institution of the monarchy. During this crucial meeting, Queen Isabella was indeed at the secret apartment with Marcus Delacroix. Security cameras positioned by Lord Blackwood's team captured her arrival at 2 in the afternoon. The photographs taken that day would become the final pieces of evidence needed to confirm the extent of the betrayal. Inside the apartment, Isabella and Marcus were discussing their future plans, unaware that their relationship was no longer secret. Marcus had been pressuring the Queen to find ways to spend more time together, perhaps even suggesting that she should consider ending her marriage. These conversations, recorded through sophisticated surveillance equipment, would later provide insight into the depth of the emotional affair. Back at the palace, King Alexander was struggling with the most personal aspect of the crisis. Beyond the political and constitutional implications, he was dealing with the devastation of learning that the woman he loved had been deceiving him for months. The pain was made worse by the realization that their entire marriage might have been built on lies. The royal physician, Dr. Harrison, was quietly called to attend to the king when staff noticed his obvious distress. Without revealing the cause, Dr. Harrison provided medication to help with what he diagnosed as severe stress and recommended that the king clear his schedule for the remainder of the day. As the afternoon progressed, Lord Blackwood received real-time updates from the surveillance team monitoring Queen Isabella and Marcus. The evidence being gathered was now overwhelming and undeniable. Every photograph, every recorded conversation, every documented meeting painted a picture of a systematic betrayal that had been going on for months. The palace's head of security, Colonel Thompson, was briefed on the situation and immediately began implementing protocols to ensure that when the scandal became public, the royal family's safety and privacy would be protected. Additional security measures were put in place around the palace, and contingency plans were activated for managing potential public demonstrations or media invasions. Queen Isabella returned to the palace in the late afternoon, believing she had successfully concealed her activities once again. She arrived for the evening's state dinner with foreign ambassadors, where she would be expected to play her role as the gracious and devoted queen consort. Her lady-in-waiting helped her change into an elegant evening gown, and she practiced her usual radiant smile in the mirror. The state dinner that evening was one of the most challenging royal events King Alexander had ever endured. Sitting beside his wife, making polite conversation with foreign dignitaries, and maintaining the facade of a happy marriage while knowing the truth about her betrayal required tremendous strength and self-control. Several guests later commented that while the king appeared dignified as always, There seemed to be an unusual sadness in his demeanor. Queen Isabella played her part perfectly throughout the dinner, charming the guests with her wit and grace. She had no idea that her husband knew about her secret life, and her confident performance only added to the king's pain. The woman sitting beside him, smiling and laughing with foreign ambassadors, was the same woman who had been in another man's arms just hours earlier. After the dinner concluded and the guests departed, King Alexander retreated to his study where Lord Blackwood was waiting with the final surveillance reports from the day. The evidence was now complete and undeniable. The time for gathering information had ended, and the time for action had arrived. The king spent the night alone in his study, reading through every document, examining every photograph, and listening to selected recordings. By morning, he would have to make decisions that would affect not only his personal life, but the future of the monarchy itself. The betrayal he had discovered was not just a marital crisis, but a constitutional challenge that would test the very foundations of the kingdom. As Queen Isabella slept peacefully in the royal chambers, completely unaware that her secret had been exposed, King Alexander was preparing for the most difficult confrontation of his life. The evidence in his hands would soon shatter the illusion of their marriage and force both of them to face the consequences of choices that had been made in secret. Dawn broke over Valdoria Palace with an eerie stillness that seemed to reflect the gravity of what was about to unfold. King Alexander had not slept at all, spending the entire night in his private study, surrounded by the evidence of his wife's betrayal. The photographs lay scattered across his mahogany desk like pieces of a shattered dream, each one a painful reminder of how thoroughly he had been deceived. Lord Blackwood arrived at the palace earlier than usual, knowing that this day would mark a turning point in the kingdom's history. He found the king standing at the tall windows overlooking the royal gardens, still wearing the same clothes from the previous evening. The sight of his monarch in such obvious pain moved the experienced advisor deeply, but he knew that personal feelings had to be set aside for the sake of the crown. The plan they had developed during the long night was both bold and necessary. King Alexander would confront Queen Isabella privately first, giving her an opportunity to explain her actions and potentially salvage some dignity in the process. If she chose to be honest and remorseful, there might be a path forward that could minimize damage to the monarchy. If she continued to lie and deceive, the confrontation would become the first step toward a very public and painful divorce. Queen Isabella woke that morning with no sense of the storm approaching. She had grown comfortable in her double life, confident that her careful planning and the loyal silence of her staff would protect her secret indefinitely. Her morning routine proceeded normally as Lady Margaret helped her prepare for what was supposed to be a busy day of royal engagements, including a visit to a children's hospital and a meeting with foreign trade representatives. The Queen's phone buzzed with a text message from Marquis Delacroix, asking when they could meet again. The message read like many others they had exchanged, casual and intimate, completely inappropriate for a married woman, especially one married to a king. Isabella quickly typed a reply suggesting they meet the following afternoon, unaware that every electronic communication was now being monitored by royal security. At 9 in the morning, King Alexander made an unprecedented decision. He canceled all of his scheduled appointments for the day and instructed Lord Blackwood to do the same for Queen Isabella. The official reason given to the palace staff was that both monarchs needed to discuss urgent matters of state that required their complete attention. Only a handful of the most senior advisors knew the true nature of the crisis. The confrontation was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the king's private office, a room that had witnessed many important decisions throughout the kingdom's history, but never one quite so personal and devastating. King Alexander spent the remaining hour reviewing his approach, determined to handle this crisis with the dignity befitting his position while also addressing the deep personal hurt he was experiencing. When Queen Isabella received the summons to her husband's office, she was initially puzzled but not alarmed. She assumed it was related to some diplomatic issue or perhaps a discussion about their upcoming anniversary celebration. She took time to fix her hair and makeup, wanting to look her best for what she believed would be a routine meeting with her husband. Lord Blackwood escorted Queen Isabella to the king's office precisely at 10 o'clock. The usually warm and talkative advisor was unusually formal and quiet, which should have been a warning sign, but Isabella was too focused on her own thoughts to notice. As they walked through the marble corridors of the palace, she was mentally planning her next meeting with Marcus, completely unaware that her secret life was about to be exposed. The moment Queen Isabella entered the king's office and saw the photographs spread across his desk, her face went pale. The confident, graceful woman who had charmed foreign dignitaries just hours earlier suddenly looked vulnerable and frightened. King Alexander watched as recognition dawned in her eyes, followed quickly by panic as she realized the full extent of what had been discovered. "Please, sit down, Isabella," King Alexander said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of his pain and disappointment. The formal use of her name, rather than the pet names he usually used in private, made it clear that this was not going to be an ordinary conversation. Queen Isabella remained standing for a moment, her eyes fixed on the damning photographs, before slowly sinking into the chair across from her husband's desk. The silence in the room was deafening as King Alexander allowed his wife to fully absorb what she was seeing. There were photographs of her entering and leaving Marcus's apartment building, images of them embracing on the balcony, and even pictures of them holding hands while walking through a private garden. Each photograph was time-stamped and dated, creating an undeniable timeline of deception that spanned several months. "How long?" King Alexander asked simply, his voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air between them, carrying with it the weight of 15 years of marriage, the trust of an entire kingdom, and the future of the monarchy itself. Queen Isabella's hands trembled as she reached for the photographs, as if touching them might somehow make them disappear. "Alexander, I can explain," she began, but her voice broke before she could continue. The lies she had been telling herself and everyone around her for months suddenly seemed impossible to maintain when faced with such overwhelming evidence. King Alexander waited patiently, giving her the opportunity to speak truthfully for perhaps the first time in their recent relationship. Queen Isabella's confession, when it finally came, was devastating in its honesty. She admitted that the affair had begun 6 months earlier, just as the investigation had suggested. She spoke about feeling lonely and neglected, about the pressures of royal life, and about how Marcus had made her feel like an ordinary woman rather than a queen bound by duty and protocol. The king listened to every word, his face impassive but his eyes reflecting the deep pain her words were causing. As she spoke, Queen Isabella seemed to grow smaller in her chair, the confidence and poise that had defined her public persona crumbling under the weight of her admissions. She talked about the excitement of the secret meetings, the thrill of being desired for herself rather than her title, and the gradual realization that she had fallen in love with another man. What hurt King Alexander most was not just the physical betrayal, but the emotional deception that had accompanied it. For months, Isabella had been living a complete lie, smiling at his side during public events while planning secret meetings with her lover. Every kiss, every public display of affection, every private moment they had shared had been tainted by her deception. When Queen Isabella finished speaking, the office fell silent again. King Alexander stood up and walked to the window, his back to his wife, as he processed everything she had told him. The gardens below looked the same as they had the day before, but everything else in his world had fundamentally changed. The woman he had loved and trusted had betrayed not only him personally, but also the institution they both served. "The photographs will be leaked," King Alexander said finally, turning back to face his wife. "Lord Blackwood's investigation has been thorough, but we cannot control every person who might have access to this information. Someone will sell this story to the press, and when they do, the scandal will destroy everything we have built together." Queen Isabella began to cry then, not the graceful tears of a queen facing adversity, but the desperate sobs of a woman who had just realized the full consequences of her choices. She begged for forgiveness, promised to end the affair immediately, and pleaded for a chance to save their marriage and the monarchy. But King Alexander knew that some betrayals cut too deep for forgiveness, especially when they involved not just personal trust but the dignity of the crown. The conversation continued for over 2 hours, with Queen Isabella alternating between desperate apologies and attempts to justify her actions. King Alexander remained calm and dignified throughout, but his questions revealed the depth of his pain and disappointment. He asked about specific lies she had told, about the risks she had taken with royal security, and about whether she had shared any confidential information with her lover. The revelation that Marcus Delacroix had been pressing Queen Isabella for information about the kingdom's trade negotiations was the final straw. What had begun as a personal betrayal had potentially become a matter of national security. King Alexander realized that the affair might have been more than just emotional infidelity. It could have been a deliberate attempt to gain access to sensitive government information. As the meeting drew to a close, King Alexander made his position clear. Queen Isabella would have 24 hours to decide whether she wanted to publicly confess to the affair and request a divorce, or face the humiliation of having the scandal exposed by the press without her control over the narrative. Either way, their marriage was over, and her position as queen consort would come to an end. The final moment of their confrontation was perhaps the most painful. Queen Isabella approached her husband's desk and reached for his hand, but King Alexander gently pulled away. The physical gesture spoke volumes about the emotional distance that had now opened between them. The trust that had been the foundation of their relationship was gone, and both of them knew it could never be rebuilt. As Queen Isabella left the office, escorted once again by Lord Blackwood, she looked like a completely different woman than the one who had entered just hours earlier. Her regal composure was gone, replaced by the hunched shoulders and downcast eyes of someone who had just lost everything that mattered to her. The crown that had once been her source of pride and purpose now felt like a burden she was about to lose forever. The 24 hours that followed the confrontation between King Alexander and Queen Isabella were among the most tense in Valdoria Palace's recent history. The palace staff sensed that something momentous was happening, though only a select few knew the specific details of the crisis unfolding within the royal family. An unusual quiet had settled over the corridors as both monarchs retreated to their separate quarters to contemplate the future of their marriage and the kingdom. Queen Isabella spent the day in a state of emotional turmoil that fluctuated between desperation and resignation. Her lady-in-waiting, Elena, noticed that the queen had barely touched her meals and seemed to be crying frequently. When asked if she needed medical attention, Isabella declined, claiming she was merely dealing with a severe headache. The truth was far more complicated and devastating than any physical ailment. Marcus Delacroix had sent several messages throughout the day, expecting his usual responses from Isabella about their next meeting. His texts grew increasingly concerned as hours passed without replies. By evening, he was calling repeatedly, leaving voicemails that expressed worry about her sudden silence. He had no idea that his secret relationship had been exposed and that royal security was monitoring all of his communications. Lord Blackwood had spent the day coordinating with various government officials and palace security to prepare for multiple scenarios. If Queen Isabella chose to publicly confess and request a divorce, the announcement would need to be carefully crafted to maintain the dignity of the monarchy while satisfying the public's need for transparency. If she refused to cooperate, and the scandal broke through other channels, damage control would become much more difficult. Prime Minister Sarah Mitchell was briefed on the developments and immediately began consulting with her legal advisors about the constitutional implications of a royal divorce. The last time the Kingdom of Valdoria had faced such a crisis was over a century ago, and the precedents were limited. Parliament would need to be involved in any formal divorce proceedings, and the political ramifications could affect the government's stability. King Alexander had isolated himself in his private study, declining all meals and refusing to see anyone except Lord Blackwood for essential updates. The weight of the decision he was facing went far beyond personal feelings. As a monarch, he had to consider the impact on the kingdom's reputation, the stability of the government, and the future of the royal line. As a man, he was grappling with the complete destruction of trust in his marriage. The palace's head chaplain, Father Benedict, was quietly summoned to provide spiritual guidance during this crisis. The elderly priest had served the royal family for over 15 years and was one of the few people who could speak honestly with the king about matters of faith and forgiveness. Their conversation that evening lasted for hours and touched on the complex relationship between personal morality, public duty, and Christian principles. Meanwhile, Queen Isabella made a decision that would prove to be the final nail in the coffin of her marriage. Instead of using the time to reflect and prepare, she focused on finding ways to continue her relationship with Marcus while minimizing the personal consequences to herself. She suggested that they should temporarily stop seeing each other until the situation calmed down, but made it clear that she had no intention of ending the relationship permanently. Most damaging of all, Queen Isabella revealed during the call that she had indeed shared confidential information about the kingdom's trade negotiations with Marcus. She mentioned specific details about tariff agreements and diplomatic strategies that were supposed to be state secrets. This confirmation transformed the situation from a personal scandal into a matter of national security that could affect Valdoria's relationships with its international allies. Lord Blackwood received the transcript of the recorded conversation late that evening and immediately brought it to King Alexander's attention. The final pieces of evidence painted a picture of a woman who was not only unfaithful but also potentially treasonous in her willingness to share state secrets with a foreign businessman. The king's last hopes for reconciliation were shattered by his wife's own words. The next morning brought a development that nobody had anticipated. Marquis Delacroix, apparently unaware that his communications were being monitored, made contact with a prominent tabloid journalist known for exposing scandals involving public figures. Security services intercepted his call to the reporter, during which he offered to sell photographs and intimate messages from Queen Isabella in exchange for a substantial payment. This attempted betrayal by her lover was perhaps the cruelest twist in an already devastating situation. Marcus had not only seduced the queen but was now preparing to profit from the scandal by selling private information about their relationship to the press. The man Isabella thought loved her for herself was actually planning to humiliate her for financial gain. King Alexander was informed of Marcus's betrayal immediately, and he made the difficult decision to have this information shared with Queen Isabella. When she learned that her lover was planning to sell their private communications to the tabloids, her world collapsed completely. The romantic fantasy she had created around their relationship was revealed to be nothing more than an elaborate deception orchestrated by a man who saw her as a profitable target rather than a woman worthy of love. The final confrontation between King Alexander and Queen Isabella took place exactly 24 hours after their first meeting. This time, however, the queen entered her husband's office as a broken woman who had lost not only her marriage but also her illusions about the man for whom she had sacrificed everything. The evidence of Marcus's intended betrayal sat on the king's desk alongside the original photographs, creating a complete picture of deception and manipulation. "He was using me," Queen Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible as she stared at the transcripts of Marcus's conversation with the tabloid reporter. The realization that she had destroyed her marriage for a man who saw her as nothing more than a business opportunity was perhaps more devastating than any punishment her husband might impose. King Alexander watched his wife's final moment of reckoning with a mixture of sadness and relief. The woman he had loved was finally seeing the truth about the choices she had made and the man she had chosen over their marriage. While he took no pleasure in her pain, he knew that this moment of clarity was necessary for both of them to move forward. The conversation that followed was markedly different from their previous meeting. Queen Isabella no longer made excuses or attempted to justify her actions. She spoke honestly about her mistakes, her poor judgment, and her complete misreading of Marcus's character and motivations. For the first time in months, she seemed to be telling the complete truth about her feelings and her regrets. However, King Alexander knew that honesty at this late stage could not repair the damage that had been done. The betrayal was too deep, the security breach too serious, and the public scandal too inevitable. The monarchy's reputation depended on decisive action that would demonstrate the royal family's commitment to honor and duty, even in the face of personal tragedy. "I will announce our separation tomorrow morning," King Alexander said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "You will have the opportunity to make a public statement acknowledging your responsibility for the breakdown of our marriage. The specific details of your affair need not be made public if you cooperate fully with the divorce proceedings." Queen Isabella nodded silently, understanding that her husband was offering her the chance to maintain some dignity in the face of an impossible situation. The alternative would be a messy public scandal that would destroy not only her reputation but also cause lasting damage to the monarchy that had been her home for 15 years. As their marriage officially came to an end in that quiet palace office, both King Alexander and Queen Isabella were forced to confront the reality that some mistakes cannot be undone and some trust, once broken, can never be rebuilt. The crown that had brought them together would now divide them forever, and the kingdom they had served together would have to find a new path forward without their partnership. The morning of the announcement dawned gray and overcast, as if the sky itself reflected the somber mood within Valdoria Palace. King Alexander stood before his bedroom mirror, adjusting his tie with hands that trembled slightly despite his determination to maintain royal composure. Today, he would address his kingdom about the end of his marriage, a moment that would forever change both his personal life and the monarchy's future. The palace's main press room had been prepared for what would be one of the most significant royal announcements in decades. Media representatives from around the world had gathered, sensing that something major was about to be revealed. The usual ceremonial decorations had been replaced with a simple backdrop bearing the royal coat of arms, emphasizing the serious nature of the forthcoming statement. Queen Isabella had spent her final night in the royal chambers packing her personal belongings with the help of her loyal lady-in-waiting, Elena. The process was heartbreaking for both women, as they carefully folded away the elegant gowns and jewelry that had defined Isabella's life as queen. Each item represented memories of state dinners, charity galas, and royal ceremonies that now felt like scenes from someone else's life. Lord Blackwood had worked through the night to coordinate the complex logistics of the separation announcement. The statement had been carefully crafted to maintain the dignity of both monarchs while providing enough information to satisfy public curiosity. Legal documents had been prepared, security protocols updated, and contingency plans activated for managing the inevitable media frenzy that would follow. At 9 o'clock in the morning, exactly 1 hour before the scheduled announcement, Queen Isabella made her way to the king's study for their final meeting as husband and wife. She wore a simple black dress that seemed to symbolize the mourning she felt for the life she was leaving behind. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by a quiet resignation that spoke volumes about the depth of her regret. King Alexander greeted his wife with formal courtesy, but without the warmth that had once characterized their private interactions. The evidence of her betrayal still lay on his desk, a constant reminder of why this painful moment had become necessary. Both of them understood that this meeting was not about reconciliation, but about ensuring that their separation would proceed with the dignity befitting their positions. The press statement will focus on irreconcilable differences, King Alexander explained, showing Isabella the carefully worded announcement. Your affair will not be mentioned specifically, but the public will likely draw their own conclusions. This approach protects both your privacy and the monarchy's reputation while acknowledging the reality of our situation. Queen Isabella read through the statement with growing emotion, seeing her 15-year reign as queen consort reduced to a few formal paragraphs about the end of a royal marriage. The language was respectful but final, making it clear that the separation was permanent and that divorce proceedings would begin immediately. She signed the necessary documents with a hand that shook noticeably, each signature marking another step away from the life she had known. Meanwhile, Marquis Delacroix was being arrested at his luxury apartment by royal security forces acting on behalf of the kingdom's intelligence services. The businessman who had seduced the queen and planned to profit from their relationship was now facing charges related to espionage and attempting to compromise state security. His phones, computers, and personal documents were seized as evidence in what would become a high-profile trial. The arrest was timed to coincide with the royal announcement, ensuring that Marcus would not be able to sell his story to the press or cause additional embarrassment to the royal family. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including recorded conversations about obtaining state secrets and his attempts to blackmail Queen Isabella by threatening to expose their relationship. At 10 o'clock precisely, King Alexander entered the press room alone, his posture straight and his expression composed despite the personal turmoil he was experiencing. The assembled journalists immediately recognized the gravity of the moment, sensing that they were about to witness a historic announcement that would reshape the Valdorian monarchy. The king's statement was delivered with the measured dignity that had characterized his entire reign. He spoke about the mutual decision to end his marriage to Queen Isabella, emphasizing their continued respect for each other and their shared commitment to the welfare of the kingdom. He acknowledged the personal pain involved but stressed that the monarchy would remain strong and stable despite this change. After much reflection and discussion, Queen Isabella and I have decided to end our marriage, King Alexander announced to the hushed press room. This decision was not made lightly, and we ask for privacy and respect during this difficult time. The Queen will retain her royal titles temporarily during the divorce proceedings, after which she will resume her private life as a citizen of our kingdom. The questions from reporters came immediately, but King Alexander had anticipated the most likely inquiries and addressed them with prepared responses. He confirmed that there were no plans for him to remarry in the immediate future, that Queen Isabella would receive appropriate financial support, and that the constitutional implications of the divorce had been thoroughly reviewed with parliamentary leaders. Most importantly, he assured the public that the monarchy remained stable and that his commitment to serving the kingdom had not wavered despite his personal circumstances. The king's calm and dignified presentation of the situation helped to minimize the potential for panic or constitutional crisis, demonstrating the leadership skills that had made him a respected monarch throughout his reign. Queen Isabella watched the announcement from her private chambers, surrounded by the packed belongings that represented the end of her royal life. The finality of hearing her marriage declared over in such public terms was overwhelming, but she also felt a strange sense of relief that the deception and lies were finally at an end. The burden of maintaining her double life had been exhausting, and its conclusion brought a kind of peace despite the pain. The public reaction to the announcement was swift and varied. Many citizens expressed sympathy for both the king and queen, understanding that royal marriages faced unique pressures and challenges. Others demanded more details about the reasons for the separation, sensing that the official statement did not tell the complete story. Social media exploded with speculation and commentary, but the palace's careful management of the announcement prevented the situation from spiraling into chaos. International allies and foreign monarchs sent private messages of support to King Alexander, recognizing the difficulty of his situation and praising his handling of the crisis. The diplomatic community understood that royal scandals could have far-reaching implications for international relationships, and they appreciated the king's efforts to maintain stability during a turbulent period. Within weeks of the announcement, Queen Isabella had moved to a private residence in the countryside, far from the public eye and the painful memories of her life at the palace. She issued a brief statement taking full responsibility for the breakdown of her marriage and asking for forgiveness from the people of Valdoria who had supported her during her years as queen. Marcus Delacroix's trial became a sensation in the kingdom's media, with detailed testimony about his manipulation of Queen Isabella and his attempts to profit from royal secrets. The businessman was ultimately convicted of espionage and sentenced to 10 years in prison, serving as a warning to others who might attempt to exploit the royal family for personal gain. King Alexander gradually resumed his full schedule of royal duties, throwing himself into his work with renewed dedication. The personal pain of his failed marriage remained, but he found purpose in serving his kingdom and maintaining the dignity of the crown during a challenging period. His handling of the crisis actually increased his popularity among citizens who admired his strength and composure. The monarchy survived the scandal intact, perhaps even stronger for having demonstrated its ability to weather personal crises with dignity and transparency. King Alexander's example of putting duty above personal feelings resonated with a public that valued integrity and responsibility in their leaders. The kingdom moved forward with confidence in their monarch's commitment to serving their best interests. As seasons changed and the immediate shock of the royal divorce faded into history, Valdoria found itself with a monarch who had been tested by personal betrayal and emerged with his honor intact. King Alexander's lonely figure walking through the palace gardens became a symbol of resilient leadership, proving that even kings must sometimes choose duty over happiness, but that such choices can ultimately strengthen both the individual and the institution they serve. The crown that had once seemed heavy with the burden of failed marriage now rested more easily on King Alexander's head, supported by the knowledge that he had faced his greatest personal crisis with the dignity and strength that his position demanded. The kingdom of Valdoria had weathered the storm and emerged with renewed respect for a monarch who had proven that true royalty lies not in perfection, but in how one responds to imperfection with grace and honor.